If you were to ask me what is the biggest difference between the original trilogy of Star Wars and the prequel trilogy, the word that I would use is cohesive. There is definitely a lot more structure implemented in the second Star Wars trilogy. And I think because of that, I've grown much more attached to the series of Star Wars due to the prequel trilogy. If you were to only feed me the first trilogy and I followed the tale of Luke Skywalker and his entire journey, I don't think you'd even be close to calling me a fan or have remote interest in it. But after watching the prequel trilogy, I have far more attachment, and to the point that I am continuing to ponder about the events of the second trilogy in my mind. There is a lot more emotional weight, interest, structure, characters, organizations that are of actual substance, and because of that it's easier for me to grow attached and for me to actually theorize and decipher and think of things that are happening on screen. The second trilogy is definitely, in my opinion, far more eventful and overall superior. But what I will say is that the second trilogy is definitely a different type of movie than the original. Let's consider the original trilogy. If I were to give Star Wars a description, I would identify it as a sci-fi action adventure movie with some strong war elements. Now, I would definitely say the original trilogy is much more leaning towards the adventure part of it. By this I mean, the original trilogy is an event-based movie, spaced and structured of the things that are happening to our characters. Okay, you may be a bit confused. What do I mean by this? If we're talking about adventure movies or adventure content in general, whether it's an adventure game, adventure story, adventure TV series, the main focus of that entire story are the things that are happening to the characters and how these characters that you know react to the problem or situation that they are placed in. I would say the pacing is definitely slower compared to other forms of genres, whether it be narrative or plot driven. It's definitely a lot slower as you spend a lot more time in certain places or in certain situations. Let me give you an example. A large amount of time during some of the movies, during the original trilogy, a part of the movie, our characters would be put into a perilous situation, and for a large portion of the movie, you'd be with these characters as they try and come up with a solution to escape. Perhaps one of them has been captured, and now they try and hatch a solution to try and escape the situation or to run away. There is far more pressure or tension applied, but it lasts not only for a short moment, but more so for the entire movie. The pressure is on for the entire experience as we are in a bad situation, and there is constant tension. This is an interesting style, and for me personally, it definitely is interesting, but in my personal opinion, I would consider it an inferior storytelling side because there is a slow pacing, because there is so much focus on an event, because not so much time actually passes. Usually, there isn't much character development or plot development for there to be interesting plot lines, interesting character interactions with multiple characters and multiple factors. And because everything usually happens maybe in a few days or a few hours even perhaps, for me personally, these types of movies or things end up being weaker in quality overall. The second trilogy definitely takes a much longer or different approach. It definitely is still an action adventure, but the second trilogy definitely focuses a lot more on world building, a lot more on implementing structures. We are first introduced to the Jedi Council. We're introduced to different factors, the Trade Federation, the Separatist, and the Republic. We're introduced to all of these different organizations and how they interact with each other, and it's very interesting on how it's implemented. What stood out to me in this one is that Anakin Skywalker is a far more interesting character than Luke Skywalker. Some people are disappointed that he fell to the dark side. For me personally, I definitely do think he made a number of mistakes, for sure. But I don't think him turning to the dark side was the answer. But I do think him being a Jedi was no longer possible. While I definitely do believe that the Jedi Council's policies and regulations are far too rigid to the detriment of the entire Jedi society, I'll be honest, this trilogy definitely involved me and interested me far more than the original. There's far more emotional weight and far more interest for me in comparison. While they are inferior in a sense if we're talking about them as an adventure movie, as a story overall, I definitely prefer the second trilogy, and that's why I think I'm actually starting to get involved and really enjoy the Star Wars series. And from this trilogy, I'm finally beginning to understand why Star Wars has so much of a fan base and why there's so much discussion on Star Wars regardless, even though the series has come to an end. They're definitely keeping this cash cow going, as after Disney acquired Star Wars and the license from Lucas and George Lucas and Lucasfilms, they've definitely made a huge amount of sequel series, sequel movies, and I'm contemplating with myself if I do want to continue watching the Star Wars movies. I'm not sure yet, but I'm under the impression that George Lucas is no longer playing a big role in making those movies, but we'll see, and after I do a little bit of research, then I'll eventually decide if I'm going to eventually watch those subsequent movie sequels. Now, let's talk about this entire trilogy as a whole and my thoughts on it. Definitely very interesting. There's some frailties, and I think what I think Star Wars does something unique that a lot of other shows and a lot of other forms of entertainment don't regularly do. What they do here is that in Star Wars, the main characters make multiple significant mistakes. And I don't mean they make mistakes in terms of them being, how do I put it, stumbling or them being clumsy. No, not in that sense. But their worldviews, their ideals, their narratives are inherently flawed. And because of their inherently flawed narratives, their inherently flawed views, the way in which they view the world, those cause ramifications that will hurt the entire universe. This is particularly pertaining to how Anakin Skywalker is handled. His emotions were not properly handled and dissected by Obi-Wan Kenobi, despite spending so many years together as being his master and Anakin being his apprentice. From the movies, there isn't much interaction that Anakin has with any other Jedis. Now understand that there are shows and comics that do try and add given context to these situations, but let's be honest, these things came afterwards, and if we're talking about what we were given at the time, all we had to work with was the movies and what was served on in the movies. Anakin doesn't have any boys, and the only other real interactions or relationships that he has is with Obi-Wan Kenobi, Padme, his wife, and the Jedi Council. Well, that's honestly more so a hate than a love relationship, you see. But that's precisely it. Their ideologies, each sector, each side plays different roles and they have different worldviews. And even though Anakin Skywalker was definitely a flawed character for sure, I completely understand why there would be a strong hesitation to give him more responsibilities as the Jedi Council. But because of that, because of them not going deeper, because of Obi-Wan Kenobi not trying to find or get a deep understanding of who Anakin really was, that's part of the reason why he ended up falling towards the dark side. Palpatine was the only person who was a genuine friend to Anakin Skywalker. He was the one who played to his ego. He was the one who propped him up, and he was the one who actually understood Anakin Skywalker properly from an emotional level. While we definitely can agree that Palpatine definitely manipulated Anakin Skywalker and was a significant factor to turn him to the dark side, Anakin made his own decisions. Anakin is a grown man. He chose to abandon the Jedis. He chose to abandon the Jedi Council, and he chose to massacre all of those people he killed on his journey to become a Sith. Now, I definitely do identify that Obi-Wan Kenobi failed Anakin Skywalker, but let's be honest, it wasn't his job or his wish in the first place to make Anakin a Jedi. It was the wishes of Qui-Gon. And for sure, I definitely do agree with the sentiments of many of the fans that if Qui-Gon was still alive and he was actually the one to train Anakin Skywalker, he would have been able to identify the frailties and his emotional instability to try and alleviate his eventual turn over to the dark side. I definitely think it's a shame, and Obi-Wan Kenobi may have been a good master, but he, in terms of him becoming a better scholar, him being a better Jedi, he was the blueprint. But he was not the master that was genuinely suited for Anakin Skywalker. Anakin Skywalker is an extremely interesting and compelling character, and he and his story is definitely the gem of this entire series. My favorite character, I think, in the entire trilogy was actually Anakin Skywalker as a child. It's rare that I'm able to come across a child character that I have so much affection for. He was truly kind and a good boy who wanted to help people despite being in a horrible predicament of him being a slave himself, a truly good person. And it's a shame that he ended up going down this route of going over to the dark side. In my personal opinion, I think there was a better solution than Anakin going over to the dark side. I definitely do find it odd how much Anakin just gave his life to Emperor Palpatine. He definitely did have options to help him out, but I found it odd for him to not show more of his cynical nature. I found it odd that he was able to just completely dedicate his life and give complete servitude to Palpatine, despite him not doing so much for him in the very beginning. I understand him doing so after he had saved his life and given him the Vader armor. He did me a solid, he just saved my life, fair enough. But before that, him giving complete devotion and dedication to him just seemed a little bit odd. Very odd to me. Now, let's be honest. Because of the choices that Anakin Skywalker has made, it was no longer possible for him to remain a Jedi, and I'm personally fine with that decision. But I think him turning over to the dark side was a little bit too extreme of a switch. He went from 0 to 100 real quick, from a good guy to being completely evil. That's a bit odd, when I personally think that Anakin Skywalker is personally much more of a morally grey character. I'm cool with him using part of the dark side and him possibly abandoning being a Jedi, but I just found it odd that he would go completely to the other side and become evil. Comical, in my personal opinion. I think him going and changing so much is a little bit comical and a product of the time. During that time period, and clearly Lucas, he goes for more, how do I put it, comically hilarious or more cliche villains. Just consider Palpatine's appearance and the voice that he uses when he's revealed himself as a Sith. It is a wee bit ridiculous, and it is definitely entertaining, but definitely much more cliche. And I think Anakin was unfortunately the product of not the best writing, or not really bad. I'm not saying that the writing was necessarily bad, but I just see it as not being so realistic. What benefits does Anakin have from completely devoting himself to Palpatine? I understand him using him until he helps his wife Padme from dying, but afterwards, there really isn't that much incentive for me to serve Palpatine. It just seemed a little bit odd. A better situation, and I personally think a better solution, would have been for Anakin Skywalker, as soon as he realized the situation that he was in, he found out that Padme was pregnant, was for him to actually abandon the Jedis, and him possibly going to Naboo, and him possibly being some sort of a bounty hunter like the Mandalorian, but of course using his Force powers, and he would be a pretty damn good bounty hunter, or even possibly becoming a general for Naboo and continuing to use his skills, but he doesn't necessarily have to turn to becoming a Sith. And I want you guys to notice this. I'm talking a lot about Anakin Skywalker, and I think it's a clear testament to why I think the second trilogy is far more interesting than the second one. I am far more invested and engaged in the characters and the story of the second trilogy in comparison to the first one. I think a lot of people have a lot of nostalgia glasses, and Star Wars is definitely still an iconic movie, but the second trilogy is definitely where it's at. I actually care about what happens to Anakin Skywalker. I actually care what happens to Obi-Wan. I actually care about the decisions they make. I actually care about their worldviews. In the previous trilogy, Vader just seemed to make a bait and switch, and he just switched up because not enough time was spent developing these characters, their motivations, and their actions for us to see some sort of development or slow incremental change for Vader to turn to the dark side. In the second trilogy, you're able to see it piece by piece, Anakin chipping away and going closer over to the dark side. But as I said before, him being somewhere in the middle, him being grey, seems much more feasible, much more viable, and a much better option overall than him going completely evil. Him looking at the way that Anakin was treating Padme seemed absolutely ridiculous. Him just yelling at her, him almost killing her with his force powers. He had definitely done a huge amount of bad things, but Padme was the very motivation that he even turned to the dark side in the first place. I don't see him being blinded by a rage and him completely tossing logic to the wayside for that to happen in this situation. So as I said before, personally, I definitely have far more attachment and interest in the second trilogy, as the genre definitely changed. It definitely turned into a character-driven political war drama instead of an adventure movie. Now, understandably, there definitely are still a lot of events that happen, and events are still important, but they aren't as important as they were in the previous movie. The narrative and characters and the way that people feel and their worldviews and the narratives are far more important than the spectacle that was in the original trilogy. And that's what I mean. The event, the spectacle, is far more important than the substance, the characters, the way they feel, than the actions that they continue to make. And that is precisely why the second trilogy simply carries more emotional weight, because they focused on something that will stay with us and we can easily much more attach ourselves to. It's harder for one as a person to attach themselves to a situation or to see somebody escaping a situation in comparison to somebody making a serious decision that's going to alter their lives forever. And that's why I think the second trilogy is far more interesting. While it is inferior in some parts, overall I'd say it's definitely a better overall experience. The second trilogy, in my opinion, I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. It's interesting. There's a lot of world building, and the world building is absolutely phenomenal. Them introducing so many characters, so many players, definitely makes Star Wars into this legendary show that it actually is. And this template was able to give so many people to create sequels, theories, comics, and all of these things. And I think it's very cool that's how things have played out. Star Wars is definitely an interesting show, but I definitely do think it's, out of all things, a product of its time, and a lot of nostalgia glasses are on. It's more so popular than high quality, in my personal opinion. It's definitely cool, but I wouldn't rate it an 8, 9, or 10. I wouldn't rate it as one of the best shows or movies or stories we've ever seen. It's definitely good in the sci-fi genre. It's definitely up there. As I'll be honest with you, sci-fi doesn't really kill it on a regular basis. The things that kill it consistently definitely do seem to be the crime shows or crime movies or medieval genre. Those are the genres that generally kill it. But in sci-fi, yeah, Star Wars might actually be the top dog in terms of that. But yeah, guys, those are my thoughts on it. Star Wars is a decent show, decent series. And yeah, that's definitely interesting, and I finally have a better understanding of the entire verse. And I think when I go ahead and maybe play Fallen Order again, or finally play Star Wars Jedi Survivor, I'll have a much better appreciation for the things that happened. As before, of course, I played or watched these shows such as The Mandalorian and Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, and played that with no previous context, as I'd never seen the movies or anything like that. So definitely interested to see how much more appreciation I'll have as I have more interest and an understanding of what happens and everything. So guys, those are my thoughts. Tell me your thoughts down there in the comments. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Which trilogy do you personally prefer? And yeah, let's have a dialogue. Take it easy, gents.